This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to an episode of Unsupervised Learning. I am here with a returning guest, population geneticist, Cesar Fortes-Lima, who is currently an instructor at Johns Hopkins and also an associate researcher at Uppsala. And we're here to talk about a paper that just came out in the American Journal of Human Genetics. I think I read the preprint a while ago, but the paper came out in February, and it's population history and admixture of the Fulani people from the Sahel. I actually did a journal club review of it a couple weeks ago, I guess. Well, when this episode goes live, it'll be a couple weeks. And so, if you're curious, you can read that too, as well as the paper, which I think is open access. But today we're going to be talking about the Fulani and what we learned from, basically like population genomic analysis of a large sample set, right? So I guess first of all, Cesar, can you tell us, what is unique about this paper? Because I believe that there were some whole genome analyses of the Fulani that also came out around, like recently. And I would like to kind of put this in the context of the ancient DNA of ancient North Africans, because I think this paper makes a lot of sense in light of that. And you kind of prefigured it, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Hi, Rasif. Thank you for the invitation. And the things that are unique in our study is the large representation of Fulani individuals across different countries in the Sahel belt. And there are previous studies, genetic studies about the Fulani from a few locations, and with this large representation of populations for this big group that is across the Sahel belt from Senegal to Sudan. So with this large representation of populations in our study, we could investigate more the population structure of the Fulani, the different groups across the Sahel, and also contacts of these groups with North African populations, modern population, and also ancient populations from the northwest part of North Africa.
Yeah, and just to put the context here, a lot of times when it comes to population genetic studies, obviously you have like a sample size of individuals, and in the modern era we have genome-wide data from these SNP arrays, hundreds of thousands of markers. Sometimes you have whole genomes, millions of SNP variants per individual called on the VCF, the variant color file. But what you did here was, sample a lot of different groups, and that's kind of important because kind of sped through it real quick. But Senegal to like Sudan, that's a really really wide expanse. Can you just talk about how you assembled the data set? Like who you had to get in touch with. I mean, do you have a lot of collaborators here? Was this difficult? Because also this is let's just say it, like, we're not gonna get into this. This is a geopolitically unstable region, so.
Yeah, the Sahel belt is quite busy and conflictive, and in several countries you have civil wars and all kind of political conflicts. And the Fulani is a particular group because it's a nomadic group, and they move quite a lot due to the environment. They go to different countries, and they don't really understand political borders in a general term. So yeah, in several countries we have local collaborators who were part of the study, and they help us to contact the leaders of the community, and with the help of the leaders, we contact potential participants for the Fulani, and because they're nomadic, we had to travel a lot. Actually, my collaborator Victor Cerny from the Czech Republic, he collect most of the samples in person in some countries, and it was a very long field work because we need to he was traveling to different countries, and it took around 20 years to collect this data set of 460 individuals across um, 18 local communities from 7 countries in our study, plus two other countries from previous studies. So in our data set of Fulani speaking populations, we include individuals from 9 countries in Africa, and some of them are quite big, like Mauritania, Niger, Chad, and Burkina Faso and Mali. So it was very intensive, the field work, and to gather together the data set for all those individuals. It was a huge challenge. And of course, we have permits for research from local institutions from each of those countries.
Yeah. Well, I don't know all that. 20 years, that's a long time, and I don't know all the details. I can tell you, my former boss that I worked with, I guess it was like, you know, 5 to 10 years ago, depending on the projects and the company. Spencer Wells of National Geographic. I will tell you, he's told me some scary stories about collecting samples in Chad. There some of these countries are caught between these geopolitical conflicts, and so this is definitely like old school Indiana Jones style anthropology.
Yeah, of course. But with help of local collaborators, you know the regions that are that are safe, more or less, and with local collaborators, you can contact the participants in their local languages, and in some countries we have the permits from the government, so we were totally confirmed and safe for this field work. Mhm.
Well, I want to say, I think one reason that I'm interested, or I've heard about the Fulani in the anthropological context is, you are talking about their nomadic lifestyle. That they're very distinct about that. They're pastoralists, they're not agriculturalists. They have an interaction with local agricultural populations, and, one thing physical anthropologists have noticed about them is, in terms of their physical features, they don't look totally similar to their West African agricultural neighbors. They look somewhat similar to them, but there are some like distinctive aspects to their features that maybe indicate a West Eurasian or North African, north of Sahara connection. But their language is a Niger Congo language. I think it's closely related to like languages like Wolof. It's like Western African language. In contrast, you have the situation with, say, the Hausa people, amongst whom they live and were assimilated in northern Nigeria and southern Niger, who speak a Afro-Asiatic language of the Chadic branch. But the Hausa themselves they look much more, you know, typical West African, and so you have this juxtaposition between what they look like maybe, and what their ethno-linguistic identity is and their connections. And so I think this is why genetics has been pretty important in trying to figure out what's going on with the Fulani. And they've been in some genome-wide data sets, and also even early on in, I think, like some Sarah Tishkoff's work, going back 15 years ago with microsatellites, they were in some of those data sets. But we did not resolve until, I would say in the last year now, I think with your paper, and then also the whole genome analysis got to some of that, and I think the ancient DNA now, which wasn't Fulani ancient DNA, but it kind of like nailed a piece of the puzzle. So yeah, can you speak to some of that in terms of what we did and didn't know, and how we've come forward in the last decade or so?
Yeah, as I mentioned, previous genetic studies were carried out in the Fulani, and they didn't have a very large representation of them from different countries. But those previous studies, they highlight admixture in the Fulani from Eurasian sources. In particular, the Fulani, they have the Lactase persistent variant that is associated to European populations, but this is a complex variant, and it seems like they got this variant due to admixture with populations from North Africa, because they also have the variant. So one of the questions in our studies is to understand or to investigate the ancestral origin of the Fulani, because in previous studies from archaeologists and anthropologists, they highlight that the Fulani, they look like Middle Eastern groups or Eurasian groups, because their morphologies of their faces, for example, and also their skin color in general is lighter than the neighboring groups. And yeah, so there are several speculations or hypotheses about the ancestral origin of the Fulani, because we can see they have some influences from the Middle East, or from the southwestern part of Europe. So in our study, we try to address this question with this large data set of the Fulani, and we compare this modern data set for the Fulani with modern and ancient datasets from the Middle East and also from North Africa, and we found this important connection with North Africa. So yeah, the question about the ancestral origin is very well addressed in our study, and also we did previous studies on Sahelian populations from from this large region before, and now with this new data set, we could address new questions that we were not able to do it before, or other researchers either in the past.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, is kind of I say phylogeography of lactase persistence, right? So, uh, lactase persistence, obviously lactose tolerance, as it's called in the West often, is the ability to digest milk, sugar as adults, lactose, because the lactase enzyme continue to be produced after early childhood. And some populations have it, and some populations don't. Northern European populations famously do. So do many populations in the Middle East. Arabs do, and then there's also populations like the Maasai, East Africa that do. The common thing about them is they're drinking a lot of milk. There is pastoralism in their society, or pure nomadism in some cases, right? But the mutations look like they would be different in the Middle East versus Europe, and the Fulani are also lactose tolerant, lactase persistent, but they have the European variant, which is interesting because there's East African groups like the Maasai, as I said, Nilotic groups in East Africa that have a different lactase persistent variant than the Fulani in West Africa, who have the European variant, whereas the East Africans have their own indigenous variants. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's just like an interesting connection, because if their genetic, contribution was predominantly, say, from North African populations or West Asian populations that was different from Sub-Saharan African, you don't necessarily predict that, right? So it's indicating like multiple different types of connections that are going into the Fulani, and that's reshaped by natural selection, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the lactase persistent is really important in the Fulani and in Sahelian populations, because it has medical implications, and also is a cultural factor. And because they live in a semi-arid environment, they don't have access to water quite often, and they need to have a supplement like milk cow's milk, and the ability to drink milk is really important for Sahelian populations, in particular nomadic groups. So the Fulani, they have the European variant, as you mentioned, and we found, Karina Slebus in her previous work, she found that this European variant in the Fulani was obtained through archaic integration with with um, with that mixture of North African groups with the European variant already. So this European variant is in the Fulani is not due to direct admixture with European groups and ancestors of the Fulani. Is due to the admixture of the Fulani with North African groups like the the Iberomaurusian, for example, or the Berber groups with the variant, because we know the Berber is a North African group that is also nomadic and move quite a lot. And this group, for example, the Berber has the European variant also. So it seems like the most likely hypothesis is the archaic integration through that mixture with North African groups with the European variant. And that was confirmed by checking the flanking regions of these lactase persistent variants in the Fulani, because those flanking regions, the genetic diversity is very similar to North African groups rather than European groups. So if this European variant in the Fulani is from the European groups, the flanking region should be also European, but it's not the case, as it was proved by Karina Slebus before in one of her previous studies.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a European variant. It's a big haplotype, which means like kind of a genetically singular, like a bunch of markers that are correlated. And so, you could have all sorts of, when this was initially discovered, you could have all sorts of hypotheses, like what could it be Visigoths during the early medieval period, late antiquity, which would be a European group, or is it an issue with, like, say, early bell beakers in the North African fringe, and then they mixed with the North Africans 5,000 years ago, or like 4,000 years ago, whatever, and then the North Africans later mixed with populations in the Sahara, who later mixed with the Sahelian population. So at that many steps of removal, you still have the original variant with the original core haplotype, and then what you're saying is the recombination and other things, the admixture, kind of like erase the original European signal, or the central Eurasian signal, because I think the original mutation. I mean, this is like a long journey, right? The original mutation, I think they assume, emerged somewhere in the eastern part of Europe towards like the Pontic steppe, and then it was at low frequency initially, and recently, over the last couple of thousand years, there's been in situ selection all over Europe, which would indicate that the selection actually postdates. So the high frequency within Europe actually, to some extent, postdates, its introduction into Europe and also North Africa, right? So it's probably like simultaneously, maybe late Neolithic, Bronze Age, that type of period, and then later transferred over the Sahel, right?
Yeah, right. And as you mentioned, there is a very strong natural selection for the lactase persistent allele in different groups, and it's very interesting because you have different variants for the European, the populations in the Middle East, and the Eastern African groups, and they have different variants, but the the ability to drink milk is really important for all those different groups, and the European variant seems to be highly selected in Europe, and also gives gave advantage to North African populations, and and later on different contacts between the Fulani and North African groups that are also nomadic, like the Berber, gave this variant to the Fulani. So it's an interesting path for the history of this variant, and it's highlighting once again how important is this variant for people living in semi-arid environments.
Yeah. So and we're talking about North Africans here. And like culturally, I mean, like, we're really talking about Berbers or Amizigh people who speak a Afro-Asiatic language that's not Semitic, but it's
Mhm.
more closely related to ancient Egyptian, to Coptic, but they're still distantly related. But we're talking like populations that are within North Africa, so they're facing the Mediterranean on the northern edge of the Sahara, and they're kind of, in a way, I think of them as equivalents of the Fulani on the other side of the Sahara, insofar as they are facing all of these Eurasian, European populations and West Asian populations on the northern edge of the Sahara, and then on the southern edge of the Sahara, you have the Fulani who are facing, these, agriculturalist populations in West Africa, on the southern edge of the Sahara. And like I think you have Jonathan Remembry's lab in Chicago does all that spatial gene flow stuff. You have some work on that. Can you talk about like barriers to gene flow that you saw in the data, just like comparing the genetic variation spatially?
Yeah, because the Fulani, the Niger Congo speakers, in particular Niger Congo, Volta Niger speakers, and they have the different dialects. The one that are the one that are from the western part, they just speak the Pular, and then you have the other major dialect, the Fulde. And because we have a very large data set across this Sahel belt, we found population structure between the two main dialects, and is highlighting the association between linguistics and geography. But the interesting part is that besides the population structure of the Fulani, they seems to have a very unique component associated to them, but also they have a admixture with there is echo. Okay. Yeah, as I mentioned, the Fulani, they have admixture with other groups, in particular Afro-Asiatic groups, and also a little bit of admixture with the European, but the admixture with the European is quite small, is between 1 to 4%. But for that mixture with Afro-Asiatic groups seems to be quite big, and it seems to be like the Berber is one of the main sources for that mixture in the Fulani, and we confirm that with modern data for Berber population from Morocco, and also with taking samples from Morocco. The Ibero-Mauritian samples, the Ibero-Mauritian is an ancient hunter-gatherer group from the Maghreb region in northwestern in the northwestern part of Africa, and that group exists before around 10,000 years ago, and the genetic diversity of this group is highly present in modern populations for the Berber, but also in quite in a quite important proportion in the Fulani. So there is a gradient of admixture from the north part of Africa to the Sahel, to nomadic groups like the Fulani, and we cannot be fully sure that the direction is from the north western part of Africa to the Sahel belt, or in the other direction, because it could be also the other ways. It could be a bidirectional admixture, but we're very confident that there had been admixture between those nomadic groups in the past, and that is present today in the genetic landscape of those groups.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, since your publication came out when it was in preparation, I mean, you put the preprint out, I think a year
Yeah.
ago, more than a year ago. It was a while ago. I saw it, I read it. And
Last year.
then the ancient North African paper came out, which is basically ancient DNA from, I think, was it like southern Libya, like something like that, northern Chad. They founded a population cluster of individuals. And basically, these individuals are not sub Saharan African, but they're also not West Eurasian insofar as like there are on the branch that led to West Eurasians, but there's still some. I've asked around, like I don't know if you have an opinion on this. It seems like the consensus is that they did not go through the long bottleneck that the out of Africa populations did, but they split off after the split from like the lineages that led to sub-Saharan Africa. So ancient North Africans, this is like associated with the Green Sahara, and so this is like a new population cluster. It looks like that's you detected it in your contemporary results from the Fulani, right?
Yeah, we published this year the preprint. We put it online last year, and since our publication this year in the American Journal of Human Genetics, after that, two papers were published about Asian samples from the Maghreb region, and those studies were published in really good journals, in Nature, and from different labs, and include Asian samples from the later Stone Age in Tunisia, in Algeria, and also in Libya, with samples that are around 15,000 years ago, or more recently 7,000 years ago. So those ancient samples are really interesting because they complement the previous samples that were available in Morocco from the later Stone Age, and they confirm these observations in our study, the contacts between the Fulani and nomadic population from the north part of North Africa. And that is interesting because the Sahara Desert is the largest desert today in the world. But today, around 10,000 years ago, it was completely green, and it was called the Green Sahara because the vegetation was completely different. You have very big lakes, in particular in Chad, and some of those lakes they have a very completely uh, environment, and also they have different animals, and they have big animals, and today in some of the lakes that are still today in the Sahara Desert, in some of the oases, you can find crocodiles. So that is a representation of how different was the landscape in the Sahara Desert before, because today is a huge desert, very difficult to cross from the north to the south. But before, people were moving quite a lot from different regions in the north part of North Africa to the Sahel belt, and that has been confirmed by those new studies that were published in Nature by Johannes Krauser group and also by David Reich group. And they're quite important because they're highlighting with the samples eh, um, things that we could already see with our study with model samples.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we've been talking about the Fulani themselves and their deep history and their deep origins. Can you just talk about a little bit? I mean, I know you're a geneticist, you're not a historian, but you're with your collaborators and doing the background reading, the introduction. I guess I just want you to speak a little bit to their kind of importance at the crossroads of the Sahara and then the agricultural zone to the south, and their role as nomads and kind of state formation and culture formation, because there's the ethnic group in northern Nigeria, we often call them Hausa, but sometimes we call them Fulani Hausa or Hausa Fulani, and just like how like those interactions worked and what you see in the genetic data of the different groups and how much admixture there was or there wasn't, right?
Is because the Hassa is an important group from Nigeria in particular. It's also in another countries in West Central Africa, but the is the no is the Dausa. You mentioned the Dausa, I guess. Because the term Fulani is from the Hausa language, and is the term that is mostly used in today by English speakers. But the French speakers or the German speakers in general, for example, they call the Fulani they call them as Paul, Peul, and in other areas with different African languages, the Fulani are called like Tukolor or Torobe or Bororo and Boro, for example, and some of them are really particular, like the Godabe, because they have this social ritual where males they have like an interesting makeup with a lot of color, and they have this kind of way of dressing with a lot of colors, and they have facial expressions that are very charismatic, and they get together to sing and dance and it's the way to find a partner, and they have cultural behaviors that are really particular in the Fulani and unique. And also they have their livestock, because they depend a lot on their animals, and some of them they're very famous for because they're cattle herders, and in some of the painting in Algeria, in art rocks from Algeria, some of the representations were very similar to Fulani people today, because they were doing representations of people with cultural factors very similar than the Fulani, or the animals. They were very similar than the Fulani, no, because in general at that time you have hunter gatherers in Algeria, for example, and yeah, to have representations of people with animals and with cultural factors similar to the Fulani is really interesting, because in the north part of Algeria is really far away from the Sahel belt. So a lot of people were debating before about the affinity between those art rocks and the paint and the Fulani, because the painting could be similar to Fulani communities. And also other questions are very difficult to answer based on archaeological material or archaeological evidence, because the Fulani, they're nomadic, they create camps that are mobile, so they're not very permanent in one location. And when they move from one region to another with their mobile camps, they don't leave archaeological evidence. So nowadays we need to address some of the anthropological questions about the ancestry of the Fulani with genetic data. And as I mentioned, with linguistics, we have this long debate about the different terms for the Fulani. They all agree that they should be divided between the two main dialects, the Fulfulde and Pular. But between those main dialects, there are other categories. In general, there are, if I don't remember, if I remember well, I think there are seven for the Fulfulde and two for the Pular. And some of the people prefer to use, instead of Fulani, they prefer to call them Fulbe or Pulo, based on the the different dialects they speak. So from the linguistic point of view, there is a lot of diversity that we couldn't handle before, and from the archaeological perspective, there are important gaps in the archaeological records. So with genetics, we could find a way to complement and to try to answer the linguistics hypothesis and archaeological hypothesis about the history of this group.
Yeah, obviously, there are some cases like, if you go to Europe or I don't know, like Ethiopia or something like that, there are places with like, literate traditions and records. And, this part of Africa has some, obviously literacy, especially related to Islamization, but you have these nomadic peoples, traveling around, and it's not like they kept like all of these records. And so I think this is where, genetics really comes in to kind of illuminate connections that people have always hypothesized, but not necessarily known like the details of. I guess I do have to ask a question. Do you have like actually like I read your paper. Trust me, I read it a couple of times. I do not recall off my top of my head if you found any sex bias in the admixture of the different ancestral components, like say ancient North African, like indigenous West African, these sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we didn't investigate the sex bias admixture, because Victor Cerny, our main collaborator, did it before for the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA of the Fulani and other Sahelian groups previously in other studies. So to present something new, we focus mostly on the autosomal part, and and we compare the autosomal part with modern and ancient groups representative of different locations and historical periods. But the sex bias admixture is not part of this study, but you can see interesting results from previous studies from Victor Cerny.
Yeah, and so did they find a skew, did they find different contributions by male or female or anything, or was it balanced?
They found different contributions. The paternal side has a European paternal sex bias, so there is a small contribution from the paternal side, but the maternal side is very similar than other populations from sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a sex bias from the paternal side. Yeah, that seems to be from Eurasia,
Yeah, yeah. So I mean,
ancient
this is
European.
This is in keeping with the bias. So I think one of the things that like reading this paper and like thinking about the Fulani and their expansion across Sahel, it reminds me a lot of Eurasian steppe populations who also obviously engage in nomadism, with livestock, and what you see there is like patrilineal systems, and you see the spread of genetic component culture, mostly male mediated. So it's like through the migration of males who assimilate, indigenous females, or I mean, I'm being polite with the word assimilate, so we don't need to get into that. I think the listeners know what I'm saying. You do not like be like, oh, Razib, why didn't you like say what you really meant? I'm like, you know what I mean. But we see like a similar dynamic, I think, here, at least hints of it, where you see, a male lineage maybe that is doing the expansion, integrating with indigenous females. On the other hand, or not indigenous, because like they're indigenous. With the ancient North African ancestry, what that is telling us is, to some extent, the ancestral component was always there, kind of in the region. It's just the population probably of the West African agriculturalists expanded, and so they mix together more. The less viscosity in the gene flow, you could say it that way. But there was obviously assimilation with local agriculturalists, which is still majority of their ancestry is similar to them, and also the language is related to the Western Niger Congo languages. So maybe they had a different language originally. I don't know, or maybe this is like a weird hypothesis, but it could be the Niger Congo languages themselves are ancient North African, and the local languages disappeared. I don't know. That would be a really weird hypothesis because the Bantu languages are extensions of that. So that would be like all of Africa then in that model would have an ancient North African language, which I don't know if I believe that. I probably don't, but that'd be weird, outcome, right? There's a lot of weird possibilities when you think about what you've discovered in terms of like the gene flow, like where it came from, when it was male or female. And then I also, I will say I was a little surprised at the very, very low fraction of, kind of like Fula admixture in some of these agriculturalist populations. So, there was like hegemony over some local territories of agriculturalists, but it looks like there wasn't that much admixture, which perhaps indicates like how how decentralized these polities were. Right? Is that what it's telling us in terms of like this the political economy or political science?
Yeah, the Fulani are really interesting because we were mentioning, we were talking about that mixture they have with Asian groups from 10,000 years ago. But when we look at the patterns of homozygosity, that is a genetic parameter to infer genetic isolation or high inbreeding, we could see that in the Fulani, there are several groups with high patterns of genetic isolation. So besides, they have admixture like with North African groups like 10,000 years ago during the Green Sahara period. After that, most of the groups they experience different events of bottleneck based on the patterns of fragments of IBD, identical by descendant, but also they experience genetic isolation based on the patterns of runs of homozygosity. So the different groups they have a kind of limited contact with other neighboring groups, in particular Niger Congo speakers and foreign speakers, um, uh, with a Afroasiatic speakers. It seems like some of the groups they still have a few contacts because the process of the expansion of Arab groups was quite big in the past, and that changed quite a lot the genetic landscape in the north part of Africa and also in the Sahel belt. But in several groups, like for example the Fulani group from Niger in Avalak, we can see very high segments of homozygosity. That is, it's an indication of a high genetic isolation. And as I mentioned before, they have some cultural behaviors for mating, like as I mentioned before, this dancing with makeup that they're doing is in some of the groups. One of those groups is also from Niger, and yeah, so they have mating behavior and genetic isolation that limits a lot the gene flow with mother groups today. That is very different than the things we can see from around 10,000 years ago.
So, we've been talking for a little while, so let me just ask you straight up, like, I mean, eh, I guess so I mentioned in my, journal, in my journal review of your paper, like, this Fulani question, like, it's been around in the 20th century, anthropologists are really curious about it, and then I remember, like, in Geoffrey Miller's book, The Mating Mind, he talked about how sexual selection might have influenced the Fulani's features. Well, it looks right now that it looks like it's mostly admixture. Okay, so we kind of there's a lot of hypothesis about this population, in the anthropological literature, and it looks like, with your big data set with whole genomes and another paper, and then also there's like the ancient North African paper, which kind of like tackles the whole broader region. A lot of the questions are now being answered. Are there future directions that you can imagine to explore more about, like, say, the Fulani or this West African, Sahelian border region? Because we do have a fair number of samples now, from coastal Nigeria because of the HAP map and Thousand Genomes. And although, like, I know that you're involved, like, you're from Brazil originally, right?
Well, I'm from Cape Verde originally. My
Okay.
family is from Cape Verde.
Oh, yeah, you're from Cape Verde. Okay, so I know you're involved in, yeah, okay, well, your name, okay, like, you guys know why I got the confused there. But anyway, but you're involved in the African genomics, projects. Like, I know I've seen, on social media, and I can tell, like, what is going on in terms of, uh there was some big, like, late, like, let's say 2019, 2018. Okay. And that kind of like 20, let's do 2015 to 2020. That's the interval. When I used to go a lot to American Society of Human Genetics conferences, and I need to go again, but anyway, well, I went once since the pandemic. But anyway, there was a lot of talk about, like, all of these, like, consortiums, and it seems like some of them, like, didn't go forward and some of them did. Africa, as we know, is interesting from a population genomic perspective, because it has, like, quote unquote, the most genetic diversity. This is like, even people on the street know this. Well, most people on the street that will read, like, National Geographic or something. Anyway, but, and so there's a lot of stuff, still to be done. Where are the consortiums and the bigger, like, collaborative projects to do, like, whole genome work in Africa? And, like, at this point, I'm talking about, like, whole genome sequences, where we can, like, collect even more variants, even more SNPs in the catalogs. Do you know what's going on with that, right now? Like, what's your take?
Yeah, that's a good question because, of course, there are several consortium, and one of the biggest one is the East 3 Africa Consortium, the Human Heredity and Health in Africa. East 3 Africa Consortium is, and they did several projects in Africa. And sorry, there's kind of echo sometimes. And they published, for example, in Nature a few years ago a big study with more than 460 whole genome sequencing samples from Africa, from different locations, and it's really big, this consortium in comparison with other main projects. Um, but yeah, you're right. There should be more consortiums and more international projects to avoid the general European bias in genomics, because we have very large projects with
Yeah.
more samples, like the UK Biobank and other main consortiums and cohorts with thousands and thousands of whole genomes from individuals with European ancestries. So yeah, there should be more efforts. One is the East Africa Consortium. I collaborate with them in a genomic study of over 5,000 participants from South Africa before. But yeah, there should be more international projects to generate more genomic data. I know a few of them that are still ongoing, and I'm collaborating with some of them. But yeah, in the future we will see more Asian, more whole genome projects for African populations, fortunately. And for the future directions of the Fulani, I know that there is a previous study with whole genome sequencing for a few Fulani individuals that it was published before in Current Biology. And yeah, so for modern DNA of the Fulani, I think we have a very good representation. I think for the future, I hope we could have Asian genomes from the Sahel belt, because unfortunately we don't have today, and we have quite a lot of gene samples from the Maghreb region, from the northwestern part of Africa, from Morocco, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, but we cannot compare them with Asian samples from the Sahel belt, because unfortunately we don't have. We can only compare them with modern samples, like I did in my study with Asian samples from Morocco and the Fulani. So in the future, I think it could be very interesting to compare Asian Sahelian samples and comparative Asian samples and model from other locations.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, the ancient samples that you're talking about, it's like obviously there's just some issues with tropical climates, whatever. Maghreb is okay, it's dry. I don't. They got some samples, what, like out of a rock shelter in Cameroon. Now, there's things that are going to happen that we can't control. The issue that you're talking about here, that's like a little frustrating, is there's 2025 right now. Whole genome sequencing is not that expensive. I mean, this seems like a lot of the problems here is just political will and just like difficulties of collaboration across different like scientific institutions across different countries and stuff like that. This is like a human problem when it comes to the contemporary genomes. Like we could just do it if we wanted to, or like if we could just like execute when it comes to the institutions and the governments and whoever needs to do the funding and whoever needs to do the projects, do the sample collection. It just seems like it's not like if you had asked me in 2015 that we would be here, I would be a little surprised that we still haven't had that many African genomes and even like genomes from West Asia, from the Indian subcontinent. I feel like the Chinese, like, they're doing some things there. We don't know everything, honestly, I think that they're doing. But some of the East Asians are kind of going ahead. But still, like, the fact that we still are way overloaded with European origin genomes is a little disappointing. And, yeah, shout out to the United Kingdom. We have more South Asian genomes from the UK than we have from, I think, the rest of the world, because of their projects that they've been doing. So this just shows you it's about like state capacity and just kind of the institutional will within a particular nation to get this sort of stuff
I
done.
I agree with you. We need to do it. We need to have more whole genomes from Africa. We need to do it, but we need to do it right. We need to have the collaboration, and we need to involve people from African institutions. We need to involve African researchers, and we need to have their lead, because, for example, in the East Africa Consortium, in this consortium, they publish over 700 papers for their research, and they did an impressive research for whole genome sequencing, and also they generate biorepositories for future research, and they trained students from African institutions. It's not that we can do it with the different platforms. We can generate whole genomes, but the important part is the human part. We need to generate data, and we need to train people from African institutions to be able to analyze the data, because they need to have also the right to investigate different questions for the genomic diversity in their countries. So I think the important part is not just do it; it's just to do it right with the collaboration of researchers from Africa, because like we need to increase the representation of African populations in genomic datasets, but also African researchers in genomic research.
All right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Okay, so I think we touched a lot of topics here in this conversation. It was great catching up with you. Probably maybe a year or two we'll see what other new thing that you're coming out with. Seems like there's always stuff that's interesting. So it was great catching up with you, bro. And so I will talk to you later.
Thank you, Rasid, again for the invitation, and yeah, it was a pleasure.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite part.